Didn't I tell you before? No matter what, family gatherings take priority. If you don't come home right now, I'll force my son to divorce you.
I couldn't stop shaking. There's no need to suddenly talk about divorce. But wait a minute, the voice that yelled earlier. When he heard about my mother's funeral, it sounded like he was angry that such an important thing was kept secret. Maybe. I thought about it for a while and tried to organize my thoughts. My husband, Ken, deliberately didn't tell me about today's family gathering. He wanted Sarah, my mother-in-law, to be mad at me. If that's the case, there's nothing left to say. I took a strong stance. Fine, I don't need Ken. Let's get divorced then. I'm Sherry, a 50-year-old housewife. 25 years ago, I had an arranged marriage set up by relatives. My partner was an only son from a well-known, respectable family in the area, and he seemed like a sincere young man.
Nice to meet you. I'm Ken Richardson. I'm only 25, but I will do my best as your husband.
I fell in love with Ken at first sight with his handsome features and clear speech. But having lost my father when I was young, I felt a bit inferior sitting at the arranged marriage meeting with just my mother. However, Ken's parents seemed very kind. Sarah, who would become my mother-in-law, spoke to me with a gentle expression, seeing how nervous I was.
Sherry, there's no need to be so nervous. We might become family soon. I'd like to get along well with you.
Those kind words cleansed my heart. My mother, sitting next to me, also smiled warmly. With this family, you could surely be happy. My mother's eyes seemed to say that. After my father passed away, my mother returned to her parents' home and raised me there. Though my grandparents have already passed away, there are still several of my mother's relatives nearby, so I don't have to worry about her feeling lonely. And the family I'll marry into, their house isn't far from my mother's, so I can visit her frequently. Thinking that, I married Ken. At first, Ken and I lived with his parents. But the house was old, so after discussing it with the family, we decided to build a new one. In our dream two-family home, Ken and his parents were kind, and I had a happy newlywed life. Ken's father was especially happy to finally have a daughter and treated me very kindly. But about a year after we got married, Ken's father passed away. On the day of the funeral, Sarah couldn't stop crying from grief, and Ken was by her side the whole time to comfort her. So I ended up doing most of the funeral preparations with my mother's help. Seeing how busy I was, Ken's relatives helped out on the day of the funeral, but Sarah and Ken didn't do anything. That night, after the funeral had settled down, Sarah came up to me with an angry look.
Sherry, how could you not shed a single tear after losing your dear husband's parent? I'm so disappointed in you for being such a cold daughter-in-law.
I was speechless at Sarah's sudden outburst. I was also filled with sadness at losing Ken's father, who had been so kind to me. But I had been so busy that I didn't have time to cry. Seeing Sarah's angry face, I couldn't say anything back. So I just apologized. I'm sorry. But Sarah's anger didn't subside, and she said something even more outrageous.
Don't just say sorry. You weren't sad because he wasn't your parent. If this is how you are, I can't imagine how it'll be when I die.
There's no need to bring up her own funeral. It's me who should be worried about the future. I had always thought of Sarah as a kind mother-in-law. But what happened? Maybe it was the sadness of losing Ken's father, but from that day, Sarah's attitude towards me became much harsher. Wake up before 5 a.m. and do the housework, or clean thoroughly without leaving a speck of dust. Sarah's drastic change was so bad that I wondered if she had been pretending to be nice all this time. If we lived separately, I might only have to deal with her occasionally, but seeing her all day, every day was unbearable. I considered working outside and discussed it with Ken, but he said it was out of the question for a Richardson family wife to work outside the home. I thought about talking to my mother about it, but I didn't want to worry her since she was relieved that I had married well. In the end, I had no choice but to endure Sarah's treatment without reaching any conclusion. If I just kept quiet and endured, maybe she'd eventually get over it. However, my hopes were in vain, and the situation got worse. It was January 2nd, the day after New Year's. Sarah had been gone since morning. Maybe she went out somewhere since the Christmas holidays were over. I thought I might be able to go back to my mother's house, where she spent the holidays alone, for just one day, so I asked Ken.
Hey, since Sarah is out somewhere today, can I go back to my mom's house for a bit?
Huh? Going back to your mom's house just for today? Well, I guess it's fine. We probably won't do anything special here or at the other house for New Year's.
The other house.
I didn't quite understand what Ken meant, so I questioned him, but he didn't answer. Something felt off, but it seemed like I had permission to go back. Deciding to take it as a yes, I packed my things in the morning and went back to my parents' house. However, as I was relaxing at my mom's house, around 4 p.m., I got a call from Sarah on my cell phone.
Hello, is something wrong, Sarah?
As soon as I answered, Sarah started yelling angrily.
Sherry, how could you go back to your mom's house on such an important day? Get back here right now.
Huh? Important day? Is there something going on?
I had no idea what she was talking about. Sarah said that every year on January 2nd, the Richardson family relatives gather at the main house of Ken's uncle, George, who was the eldest son of Ken's father. But I hadn't been told anything about this, and Ken didn't mention it either.
I wasn't told anything about this. Even when I asked Ken this morning if I could go back, he didn't say anything.
Don't make excuses. Just get back here immediately.
Although I was frustrated by Sarah's anger, I hurriedly started getting ready to leave. My mother, seeing my rush, spoke to me worriedly.
Sherry, I'm sorry. I should have told you to stay with your in-laws.
No, it's not your fault, Mom. I'm the one who's sorry for making you worried.
I told my mom that and hurried back home. When I got home, Sarah was waiting for me, standing firm. Seeing her, I quickly bowed my head.
I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm late.
Never mind that. We're heading to George's house immediately.
We drove to George's house in Ken's car. During the drive, Sarah continued her lecture.
Listen, in the Richardson family, we have family gatherings at George's house twice a year, on January 2nd and in mid-June. So, no matter what, those gatherings take priority.
Even while being lectured by Sarah, I was annoyed at Ken for driving with a nonchalant face. I wished he'd say, "I forgot to tell her," at least once. That would have saved me from this long lecture. Since then, even when I was busy with raising a child, I never missed attending the biannual family gatherings. If I skipped even once for being busy, Sarah would scold me in front of the kids. Our only daughter, Emily, who was born a year after Ken's father passed away, would often beg to go on a family trip for New Year's. But I could never grant her that wish. Even when I thought about taking Emily to see my mom, we had to spend the beginning of the year with Ken's family, and it wasn't until later that we could visit my mom. My mom, being considerate of my in-laws, said it was fine to come home after the new year. Even though there were relatives nearby, she lived alone. Knowing she was lonely and considerate of me broke my heart. 25 years passed like this. My mom, now 80 years old, has become very frail and is in a care facility. I still live with Sarah. Sarah, who is 4 years younger than my mom, is still healthy, spending money on her hobbies and socializing with friends. For these 25 years, I've been a housewife, taking care of the house, Sarah and Ken from morning to night. Sarah still often criticizes me. However, things have become a bit easier since Emily, who has graduated from college, now helping me with the housework. So lately, I've been living without much complaint. Then, I received a call from the facility where my mom was staying. My mom had suddenly collapsed and was rushed to the hospital by ambulance. In the pouring June rain, I hurried to the hospital. But my haste was in vain, and my mom passed away shortly after. Mom. As I was engulfed in sadness, a staff member from the facility handed me something. It was a message my mom had written for me before she passed away. She had entrusted the staff to give it to me after she died. The message said she wanted a small family funeral with only close relatives who lived nearby. She was being considerate, not wanting to burden me, thinking that I couldn't stop my tears from flowing. But I was the only family she had. I couldn't afford to be sad forever. I immediately contacted the relatives and began arranging the funeral. Of course, I told Ken and Sarah the time and place of the funeral, but Ken frowned and said,
Wow, that's quite a small-scale funeral. One of those modern small family funerals. I won't attend such a small funeral because it would look bad for the Richardson family.
Yes, I'm not a blood relative of the deceased, so I'll refrain from attending. There's no reason for me to go to such a small family funeral.
I could hardly believe my ears at their words. Normally, even if the other side didn't want it, it's common sense to call relatives to a funeral. That said, I didn't want those two selfish people to attend anyway. Emily loved my mom, and when I told her the sad news, she stayed in her room crying. I went to her room, gently rubbing her back, and asked her to attend the funeral with me. Emily, with tears streaming down her face, nodded quietly.
Yes, of course, I'll go. Grandma was so kind and I loved her. I want to say goodbye properly.
I was touched by Emily's kind heart and hugged her gently. And then, on the day of the funeral was held with about 20 of my blood relatives, including my parents' siblings. The relatives looked puzzled that neither Sarah nor Ken was there. I didn't know what to tell everyone about Ken, but saying goodbye to my mom was the most important thing. So I didn't mention Ken at all. Then the funeral began. Just at that moment, my phone, which I was about to put on silent mode, started ringing. It was Sarah calling. I had informed her of the funeral time, so it must be urgent. Ignoring it could lead to unknown repercussions later. Worried about the eyes around me, I stepped out from the entrance to take the call. Hello, what's wrong? I asked in a low voice, and Sarah shouted angrily.
What do you mean, what's wrong? Don't you know what day it is today? It's the important biannual family gathering. Come back home right now.
Well, today is my mother's funeral, and it's about to start. I informed you about it. Besides, I didn't know today was the family gathering. When I responded, Sarah clicked her tongue in annoyance. She said she had clearly told Ken about today's gathering. Yet, she couldn't believe that I, as the daughter-in-law, wasn't there, and she shouted in an agitated voice. In the background, I could faintly hear Ken's voice. He was talking to someone, saying, It's her mother's funeral today. A male voice responded angrily. What? But Sarah cut him off with a loud voice.
I told you before. No matter what, the family gathering takes priority. If you don't come back right now, I'll force my son to divorce you.
I couldn't stop shaking. There's no need to suddenly talk about divorce. But wait a minute. The man's voice that yelled earlier. When he heard about my mother's funeral, it sounded like he was angry that such an important thing was kept secret. Maybe. I thought about it for a while and tried to organize my thoughts. Ken deliberately didn't tell me about today's family gathering. He wanted Sarah to be mad at me. If that's the case, there's nothing left to say. I took a strong stance. Fine. I don't need Ken. Let's get divorced then. Sarah was momentarily speechless at my unexpected response. Then she suddenly burst into laughter.
What are you talking about? Acting all tough like that? You've been living off us since you became part of this family. How can you say you won't be troubled by a divorce?
Sarah's condescending tone annoyed me, but I didn't intend to argue back. Who is she to say they've been supporting me? Sarah seemed to have forgotten something important. But if she's forgotten, let it stay that way. Well, right now, I'm in the middle of a funeral, so we'll discuss the divorce later.
Hey, wait a minute. Who said you don't have to come to the gathering? You have to attend the family gathering. You do understand, don't?
I hung up before Sarah could finish her sentence. Even if I said nothing, George, Ken's father's brother, was probably already saying something to them. As I stood there with my phone, Emily called out to me.
Mom, what's wrong? The funeral is about to start, and everyone is looking for you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll be right back. Right. I don't have time to deal with Sarah right now. I need to get back and say goodbye to my mother. As I went back inside, the funeral staff and relatives were all waiting for me to return. As I placed flowers in my mother's coffin during the farewell ceremony, I whispered in my heart, Mom, I'm going to say goodbye to Ken. I'm sorry for being such an unfilial daughter, but from now on, I'll live strongly without relying on anyone. Please watch over me from heaven. As I looked at the coffin with a mix of sadness and determination, Emily seemed to sense something and showed a worried expression. On the way to the crematorium after the funeral, Emily asked me in the car,
Who were you talking to on the phone earlier? You seemed different after that.
Although it wasn't the right time to discuss it, I thought Emily should know soon, so I decided to be honest. I explained that today was supposed to be the Richardson family gathering. Of course, Emily said, I didn't hear anything about that either. Which means Ken deliberately kept it from me, leading to Sarah's angry call earlier. When I told her that I had decided to get a divorce, Emily understood.
That's terrible. It's clearly Dad's fault. I think you're making the right decision, Mom. No matter what Grandma says, I'm on your side.
Thank you, Emily. Sarah's condescending attitude toward me had always made Emily dislike her. No matter how hard things get, I have Emily by my side. So there's nothing to fear. Feeling relieved after telling Emily everything, my phone rang again with another call from Sarah. I ignored it for a while, but she kept calling incessantly like a relentless telemarketer. It had been about an hour since the last call. Perhaps George had said something to her by now. However, as I was about to enter the crematorium, I decided not to answer and turned off my phone. After the ceremony, while waiting for the cremation to finish, I turned my phone back on in the waiting room. The call log showed Sarah had called even more times. As soon as I thought that, my phone rang again. I stepped out of the waiting room to avoid being overheard by other relatives and answered the call. Before I could say anything, Sarah's thunderous voice roared in my ear.
Finally, you answer. Sherry, how could you keep something so important from me?
What? What are you talking about? I hadn't hidden anything. I couldn't understand what she meant. Sarah, exhausted from her repeated calls, was panting heavily. Seeing her state, I tried to calm her down first. Sarah, please calm down. Take your time and tell me what happened.
Oh, so high and mighty. You hid the fact that the house is in your name. That's why you can so easily say you want a divorce and plan to kick Ken and me out.
I was stunned by her accusation. How could she not know the house was in my name until now? She was present when we finalized the purchase. Did she not pay attention? I had shown her the documents, too. I went through the details of buying the house in my mind, but I hadn't hidden anything from Sarah. Sarah, I never hid the fact that the house is in my name. You were with me during the process, and you saw the documents. Despite my clear statement, Sarah's response was childish.
Those complicated discussions and documents were beyond me. I trusted Ken and you to handle it. It's your fault for not explaining it properly later. That means you were hiding it.
With that, Sarah hung up the phone. How unreasonable. By the way, the land we built the house on was left to me by my late father for my future. My father came from a good family and owned a lot of land in this area. He and George had been best friends since their student days. That's how my mother, who knew George well, arranged my marriage to Ken. After the wedding, George discussed it with my mother, who managed the land after my father passed, and they decided to build our new house there. The truth is, since my parents owned it, I did have a desire to live with my mother, but she insisted the house was for me and my new family. When we planned the new house, Ken's father initially hesitated to accept land from the bride's family. What my mother told my father-in-law at that time still remains in my heart.
I understand your feelings, but it was my late husband's wish to build a house on this land for our daughter after she got married. So, I wanted to fulfill that wish no matter what. So, please don't worry about it being from our family, and take care of Sherry.
Ken's father accepted this after hearing my mother's words. Ken and Sarah were present during this discussion, but as I pondered these things, there was a commotion at the crematorium entrance. Curious, I went to see, and there was Sarah. Ken and George followed closely behind, probably chasing after her. Sarah brushed off the staff, trying to stop her, and approached me. George apologized to the staff, bowing his head.
Sherry, even if you divorce Ken, I won't leave this house.
Sarah suddenly raised her voice, yelling. George approached from behind and grabbed her arm.
Now hold on. Today is Sherry's day to say goodbye to her dear mother. This conversation can wait.
Let go of me. If I hadn't heard about the deed from you, I'd be getting kicked out of the house with Ken right now.
My relatives, witnessing the commotion, were stunned. George released Sarah and bowed deeply to everyone.
I'm truly sorry for the disturbance.
George had reprimanded Ken for attending the family gathering without mentioning anything about my mother's funeral. Maybe that's why Ken looked so sheepish. I couldn't forgive Sarah for causing this scene, but the real issue was that Ken hadn't told me about the family gathering. I confronted Ken. Ken, why didn't you tell me today was the family gathering? Not just that, but you never tell me the important things. I've been upset since we got married.
Huh, important things? Like what?
Ken's nonchalant response made my frustration peak. He had completely forgotten how he never informed me about family gatherings and how I got scolded by Sarah for it. When I pressed him, Ken's insensitive replies left me speechless.
Well, I thought it was obvious. Growing up, it was normal for relatives to gather twice a year, so I assumed you knew.
It seems that Ken had been taken to family gatherings by his parents since he was very young. So he assumed that having family gatherings was normal for every household. But for a grown man, married, to not inform his wife about important matters, thinking it's okay because he had no ill intentions, is ridiculous. I could only sigh. I'm done with Ken. He'll just nod and agree when his mother tells him to divorce me. I later found out that Ken's confident demeanor at our arranged marriage meeting was rehearsed, instructed by his parents. But that didn't matter anymore. As I stared at Ken in disbelief, George put his hand on Ken's shoulder, asking if the discussion was over.
Seriously, how can you not attend your wife's parents' funeral? If you'd told me, I would have at least paid my respects. Sherry's mother was also the wife of my best friend.
George's words to Ken surprised me. It contradicted what Sarah always said. George, Sarah told me that no matter what, the Richardson family gathering takes priority. George looked at me wide-eyed. Then he glared sharply at Sarah.
What is this about? If the gathering is inconvenient, just let us know, and you can skip it. So why did you tell Sherry otherwise?
Sarah froze, her face turning pale.
Well, since the Richardson family is prestigious, I've served as a dutiful wife since I married into it. I wanted Sherry to understand that.
In response to Sarah's desperate statement, George froze for a moment, then burst into loud laughter.
That sounds like something from an old TV show with a mean mother-in-law. Our family may be long established, but no one holds such outdated views.
George's laughter made my relatives, the staff, and other funeral attendees chuckle too. Although it was an unexpected situation at a crematorium, my mother might have been pleased with the cheerful send-off. Meanwhile, Sarah looked like a ghost, lost and out of place. I remembered something I wanted to ask Sarah. Sarah, earlier you said you were supporting me. I've never received any money from you. What did you mean by that?
Well, since you married into the family, you're supported by us. Why ask something so obvious?
No matter how the conversation went, Sarah's outdated views wouldn't change. Sarah herself probably knew she was being unreasonable, but couldn't back down. Truthfully, Sarah had no merit other than being part of the Richardson family. She clung to the old idea that a wife must serve the family because she feared losing her place. People around her laughed, and she blushed, looking down. George, seeing Sarah's plight, stood up.
Oh, this is getting us nowhere. All this talk about being the Richardson family's daughter-in-law. You're just bragging about being part of the Richardson family.
No, that's not it.
Indeed, Sarah was originally a daughter-in-law to the Richardson family. It's understandable if people say she's boasting about being married into a prestigious family. George finally lost his temper with Sarah's high-handed and brazen behavior.
Enough already. What do you think of our family? If you treat the Richardson name like a brand, you should remove yourself from our family. Our lineage isn't here to serve your pride.
Eek.
Usually gentle, George's sudden outburst left Sarah utterly frightened. Feeling relieved, I decided to deliver the final blow to the now crestfallen Sarah. And just as you said, Sarah, since I didn't return home during the funeral, I'll divorce Ken. And since the house is in my name, you and Ken will have to leave. But don't worry, I'll handle the division of property properly. The mention of property division softened Sarah's expression.
Property division. Yes, since the house was built after our marriage, we should split it half and half with Ken.
My relatives, listening in, laughed softly again, but Sarah seemed oblivious. Well, the divorce is between Ken and me, so I can handle the division details before filing the papers. George took Sarah and Ken back, and we managed to complete the funeral peacefully. The divorce would be dealt with later. 2 months later, Ken and I officially divorced. As expected, Ken simply followed Sarah's directive to get a divorce. George oversaw the discussions regarding property division. Sarah, feeling reassured, was present but not really paying attention. A few days later, Sarah began calling incessantly. This was expected.
What do you mean the house isn't part of the property division?
Sarah yelled angrily. Clearly, she hadn't listened to anything before. The land was left to me by my father, and my mother used her entire fortune to build the house, making it my personal property. So, even though it was built after marriage, it wasn't subject to division. Sarah was removed from the Richardson family registry and had no close relatives since her siblings had passed away. Ken's father's inheritance was squandered over the years, leaving Ken's income as the only support. However, Ken had recently quit his job. Ken's company building was on land owned by my family, and after our divorce, the company demoted him. When Sarah heard about the demotion, she told Ken to quit, and he obeyed. I had suffered emotional pain from the hardships at my in-laws' home. When I consulted George about claiming compensation from Ken and Sarah, I learned of Ken's unemployment. Although I considered giving up on compensation, George urged me to hire a lawyer. My relatives, who witnessed Sarah's abuse at the crematorium, served as witnesses, and I successfully claimed compensation. After paying me, Ken and Sarah were left with debts and came begging George for help.
Please, hire us as housekeepers. Help us.
George made them an offer.
We can't hire you, but I can refer you to a distant relative who needs help.
Ken and Sarah rejoiced at this. But the referred place was a small rural town at the northernmost point of the United States. There, they worked for a 90-year-old woman living alone. She needed care but refused to enter a facility. Despite requiring assistance, she was mentally sharp and outspoken. Ken and his family are struggling because they are constantly being told that's how it was in the old days. Especially Sarah, who is now dealing with someone with even more outdated views than her own, regrets imposing those old-fashioned ideas on me when I was her daughter-in-law. It was too late for regrets. Though she was part of the Richardson family, the elderly woman lived on a pension, so the income was low. I stayed in touch with George after the divorce, who kept me informed about Ken and Sarah's circumstances. Now I live with Emily, just the two of us. When I told her about Ken and Sarah, as I heard from George, Emily burst into laughter.
Honestly, both Dad and Grandma got what they deserved.
Really, they can't escape now because they have no money. With that unpleasant family gone, our home is now filled with laughter. I find staying at home boring, so I work a part-time jobs for 5 hours a day. In the evenings, Emily and I enjoy drinking together and sharing funny stories, which has become my favorite time of the day. Having a house free of troublesome people is truly wonderful. Eventually, Emily might get married and leave home. When I mention this, Emily always says,
I won't leave you alone, Mom. If I do get married, I'd want it to be to someone easygoing who can talk to you about anything. That way, our home would be even happier than it is now.
Oh, do you think it'll be that perfect?
Well, I definitely won't marry someone like Dad.
Laughing at such silly things, we enjoy another evening of drinks and funny stories.